Welcome to the Revenue Builders Podcast, a weekly show featuring B2B sales leaders and executives. Hosted by five-time CRO John McMahon and Force Management co-founder John Kaplan, the show goes behind the scenes with the people who have been there, done that, and seen the results. If you enjoy our content, please subscribe, rate, and review the show to help us reach more people. Revenue Builders is brought to you by Force Management. We help companies improve sales performance, executing the growth strategy at the point of sale. Find us at forcemanagement.com. Enjoy today's episode.
So, Kino, we're going to talk about negotiation today. So when do you think that sales reps should start thinking about negotiation during the sales process?
It's good to be back, John.
Good to see you, Kino.
Thank you. Yeah, I feel like one of those Saturday Night Live special guests that's made subsequent appearances. I feel very honored. I think we should start by kind of talking about when reps do actually start thinking about negotiation. And it's kind of a big problem in the industry. We have all been conditioned through a lot of bad management and a lot of bad training to start thinking about negotiation towards the end of the sales process. And, my experience, especially with reps that didn't have the good fortune of working under your tutelage and the PTC machine back in the day, kind of think about negotiation as trading some pricing concessions, usually for a deal within a specified period of time. And that is certainly not a bad thing, but I think that we're missing opportunities to get so much more out of the negotiation, not to mention a higher price point, which is what we all want. So, a long time ago, before I became a peddler, I was a fledgling economics professor. And for those of us that took econ in college, microeconomics specifically, you can kind of think about the two polar opposites of a market. On the right-hand side, you have the worst possible market you can be in as a vendor, and that is a purely competitive market. That would be like farmers selling apples at a farmer's market, right? There is no differentiation between the products. So ultimately, what's going to determine the price or what determines who's going to sell the apples is price and price alone. Whoever's selling the cheapest apple gets the whole market and the other guy gets nothing. And then on the far other extreme is the concept of a monopoly, where you're the only game in town. And this would be something like insulin, where you could basically double the price of insulin and the amount that people purchase is going to still be about the same. So as this pertains to when we should start thinking about negotiation, it should be from the very inception of the sales process. And the way to start effectively negotiating is by characterizing your product as a premium brand, as a monopoly, as insulin, even though we're not anywhere near the point of talking about price. Even if you are not representing a premium brand, you want to characterize yourself as a premium brand, and you want to do this for a couple of reasons. The first reason is you're planting a seed that we're going to be able to leverage later on towards the end of the negotiation process. And the second thing that we're doing is we're setting a trap for the competition that will ultimately show up at some point in the sales process. Also, by painting yourself as a premium brand early, the cost of walking away from the business for the prospect is very high. They don't know anything about your solution yet. They're not really that vested. There's no reason to not continue evaluating your product. So you lose very little, but you stand to gain a lot towards the end of the sales process if we do our job right, which I think we'll spend some more time talking about later on today.
Let's go over a couple of those things, though. You said, that, first of all, that you plant the seed in the customer's mind on price. Are you saying that essentially like you're anchoring a price point in the customer's mind for any type of future negotiation?
You are, not with a number, but with a perception. So you're going to say things like, I should mention that we're a premium brand. So if you're looking to buy the cheapest solution, we're not going to be the cheapest solution. Also, what we have found is historically, when it comes time to brass tacks and our competitors find out that we're in the deal, you're going to see them start slashing the prices because they know that's the only way that they can potentially win the deal. If they don't end up doing it, you've lost nothing. If they do end up doing it, they've walked right into the trap that you've set from the very beginning. But the customer is already thinking in their mind, oh, this guy's peddling insulin. He's not peddling apples. Therefore, I should expect to end up paying more if we end up even doing this thing. And I'm not going to walk away from the evaluation right now because I don't even really know what we're talking about. But you've accomplished your primary objective. You've already put separation between you and plan B, which is what we want to do from the very, very beginning.
And that's why you think for the customer to walk away, he has nothing to lose. So why not figure out what the price is or what value this company can bring to my company? And that's why they don't walk away. Now, what I'm also hearing in there, and based upon experience, if I'm dealing with a really low level person that really doesn't have a budget anyway, they might walk away, probably will walk away. And it's probably to my benefit that they did walk away.
Well, that calls into question your salesmanship. That's a whole nother episode of Revenue Builders. If you're talking to Larry low level from the get-go, you probably shouldn't be listening to this. You should probably think about a career as a painter or something other than a sales guy. But yes, if that's the case, then what I would say is tread very lightly and try to buy yourself some time before you even broach the subject of price until you can get a little bit higher in the organization where people have a tendency to evaluate value and not price. You can't evaluate price without knowing what you're getting for that price. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to buy ourselves time in the sales process to establish what that value is going to be in the manner in which is going to be most acceptable to the customer, which is usually a business case or an ROI.
I like this. We're kind of on this first point here for the audience that I think is going to be one of the themes that we talk about today. But negotiation is a process, not an event, is kind of what you're highlighting here. And you're talking about starting early. You've highlighted the principles of an anchor, which I really, really like. We'll come back and talk about that. Another thing that I heard recently, which I really liked, and I'd like to talk about this as we progress, is that if you're listening to this right now and you hear yourself talking about negotiating, that is an individual skill, and negotiation is a company competency. So as we go through the conversation today, I'd like to talk about the responsibility of companies to really prepare their sellers for the competency of negotiation. And I think it's important when we talk about walkaway points, that's not arbitrary. When we talk about value, that's not arbitrary. Those are very specific topics that need to be planned out very, very well at a company level. So I just want to kind of level set that as we go through the day.
Yeah, good. So Kino, when do you think, maybe we go to the other side of the table, when do you think the customers, start to think about pricing and value in the sales process?
Very early in the sales process. And when you don't have a reference point, and this is the dangerous part in the sales process, the customer is going to arbitrarily assign a value to your software. And in almost every instance, that price that they assign is going to be much closer to apples than it is going to be to insulin, which is okay, as long as that doesn't become the anchor point. That's what we should expect. That is why we come out of the gate swinging saying, hey, Skippy Jack, we're peddling insulin here. We're not peddling apples. That's why we do that from the very beginning. But then the next thing that we want to negotiate when we're at this point in the sales process that becomes critical to preserving margin towards the end of the sales process is negotiating the manner in which the software is going to be evaluated and the process by which we're going to determine the value of the software. That is the next negotiation point. Because if you don't sell how you're going to be evaluated, you are going to end up being an apple in the 11th hour. And if you effectively negotiate the manner in which your software and its value is established, that in of itself is going to all but ensure you're going to be closer to insulin on the spectrum when we get down to brass tacks.
Well, it also really speaks to and highlights the importance of doing a really good discovery process. If you don't do a really good discovery process to understand how your software can align to their pain and deliver value, then you're already in trouble.
100%, John. It is also a real good reason to avoid giving price too early in the sales process. If we've stumbled upon that unfortunate situation where the customer is demanding a price before we've had a chance to establish the reference point, and they think that price is an apple. If you come in too high, you're going to get fired from the process. That is what success looks like early in the process, is to either avoid giving pricing or to make pricing so confusing that you're allowed to continue on in the evaluation process before they make a go, no-go decision. So oftentimes when prospects ask me how much it cost, or they say that's too much, if I have given them price, they say, well, we can't really give you a final price until we've gone through an exhaustive requirements gathering, because I don't know what the configuration is going to look like yet. I don't know which modules that you need. I don't know what interfaces are going to be required. I don't know what integrations are going to be necessary. I'm not ducking you. You're just asking me to give you something that I can't possibly give you without having gone through at least these steps in the process.
Here's where I think authenticity really has to be in place, and intimacy and trust has to be in place, and you have to establish that, because it's at this point, I think, that sellers really lose control of all of that. So, for example, if you sit in the shoes of a buyer, let's just be a buyer on anything you've gone and recently purchased. You're not going in blind. You have an idea based on past experience. That's what data tells us. Based on past experience, which is probably not the same experience that you're going to be offering me as a seller. However, that's what I have in my mind. And I can almost guarantee you that this concept of price is going to come up way earlier than you wanted to. And I think that authenticity really, really has to take place here. So I'm a big believer in, you have to acknowledge when the customer says that, they're saying, hey, just so I can know, what's an average configuration or what have you. And you got to make sure that you're not negotiating based on what I call like single topics. So price is certainly going to be a consideration. And I promise you, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, we're going to talk about price. What I'd like to do is get all the things up on the table, the configurations, in order to do that, I'd like to get the solution up on the table, and we will absolutely talk about price. But any positioning or posturing here about unwillingness to give a price, it's really a fine line. And I think that's where the trust starts to get a little shaky. Comments on that, gentlemen?
You are spot on, John Kaplan. And with respect to authenticity, it's not unreasonable to explain why you can't give them a price, as long as the arguments that you're making are logical. And we just talked about several examples. There's going to be instances where, especially if a customer is already in a process, you're not there first. That's a completely different sales motion, where you may have to encounter a procurement person very early on in the process. When I say early on, early in terms of when you landed in the deal, but this could be a process that's been going on for 6 months. You're not going to have that luxury because they're going to know what interfaces, they're going to know what their requirements are. So in instances like that, a good plan B is, remember, we're trying to avoid giving pricing until we can get the ROI done. That's the most critical thing here. You can give very broad ranges where the price is likely to end up. You can also say there are a number of commercial terms that we haven't discussed that will have a material bearing on the price that don't make sense for us to discuss until we've been selected as vendor of choice. Press releases, metrics, case studies, payment terms, length of the term, et cetera, et cetera. Again, going back to your point about authenticity, nobody that's a business person would discount the fact that those things will have a bearing on the price and that it doesn't make sense for us to discuss those until we're closer towards the end of the sales process.
I love that. And I like to get these topics. I like to get the topic up on the table actually sooner than later. When I feel the pressure from the customer, just avoiding it and pretending, here's reality and here's me, just kind of pretending that the customer isn't concerned about it. I like to pivot a little bit and look at the customer and say, when they say, hey, I only have a budget, and I say, okay, what do you have in your budget? How did you come up with that? And I go into discovery. It's kind of like wherever you are, there you go. And I ask about those things. And how did you come up with that? Okay, with that solution, based upon our last solution, I ask discovery questions about what's the thing you like most about the last solution that you have? And what brings us to the table today to talk about a different solution? So there are things that you don't like, or there are things that you're struggling with. And I get it up on the table. So we've established that paying what you're paying for right now does not make sense because it's not fitting your criteria, and budgeting for that. Does that make sense? I like to get that up on the table, get good dialogue with it, and just get a good rhythm on that for the customer. And then I'll say things like, okay, we really have a budget in place to say, walk me through the last time you bought something outside of your budget.
Mm-hmm.
What constituted that? But I mean, just discovery questions to get this, to bust this budget conversation, to bust this too expensive conversation. I just have discovery and let them walk through it.
So I'm going to agree with 75% of what you said, Cap, and I'm going to respectfully disagree with one specific thing that you said. And that is asking the customer what their budget is. And I'll tell you why I don't think that that's a good thing to do. First, you're basically sending a message. I'm going to take everything that's in your budget. Okay. That's the first thing. And we have to, putting ourselves in the buyer's shoe. That's what they hear. He's asking me what my budget is because he wants all the budget. Everybody wants a deal, right? At the end of the day, we all want a deal. That's the first reason I don't like that question. Second, let me tell you, if they've fallen in love with you, budget stops becoming an issue. They will find the money. There is always ways to find the money. It's also premature to the negotiation protocol that I'm going to advocate for maybe as we progress through the conversation, because when you say you don't have budget, does that mean you don't have CapEx? Or that means you don't have OpEx? Especially if you work at a startup, there's lots of creative ways that we can tap into different kinds of budgets. SaaS is typically thought of as OpEx, but there have been some changes with the accounting rules the last few years that a lot of prospects don't know about that allow you to pay for it with CapEx. But you're making a mistake having that discussion with Larry Low Level, Arnold the Ankle Biter, or Marvin the Minion. You want to have that discussion with the finance guy, the person that controls the budget. So I like
that. I like everything you're saying, and I'm in total agreement with you. And in the discovery process, I think those things come up. If you get stuck, because sometimes you get stuck and somebody's just saying, well, it sounds like you're really, really expensive. And then, what do? You say, okay, you have to kind of, it's like objection handling. Mm-hmm. Everything that you just said is fantastic. When you come up with a budget, what are things that go into your budget? CapEx, OpEx. There's a time And it might not be ideal for you, but when that time comes, you have to open it up with discovery, like you just said. So I like how you clarified that. I like that a lot.
When the customer says your solution is too expensive, it's a golden opportunity to underscore what we're ultimately trying to get to before we start negotiating the final price. And the $1 million question is, how much separation have I put between me and Plan B? Plan B could be the competitor's pricing. Plan B could be build it yourself, or Plan B could be do nothing. Those are all the alternatives. And you won't figure out or be able to figure out what kind of a premium you can get until you understand how big the gap is between your solution and the alternatives. So when they say your solution is too expensive, this should be a reflex. Listeners, this should be a reflex. You should immediately ask, too expensive relative to what?
Yeah.
My competitors? The business case? Doing nothing? Building it yourself? This will give you some insight how to handle that objection. Rookie sales reps, when they hear it's too expensive, the first thing they do is discount that proposal right there and then. That is a catastrophic mistake, my friends. Always ask relative to what. And again, we're trying to defer this conversation as long as possible. At a minimum, until we have an established ROI and an established business case, because that's what we want our price point to be relative to. The opportunity cost of not going with us. That's what we want the alternative to be. Not our competitor's price, not their budget, not building it yourself or anything else that we've talked about.
Well said.
You know, I had a situation where Blade Logic and Kino was a competitor, but basically we would charge $2,000 a server. And I remember being at the top levels of some companies, and the customer would ask me, you know, how much is that, John? And I'd say it's $2,000 a server. Customer would say, John, I have 200,000 servers. I'm not paying you $400 million. And I would say, yeah, you're right. You're not paying me $400 million. I'm only asking for the opportunity to work with your people and come back to you with a cost justification that can show the tangible business value that we can bring to you and your organization based upon your numbers. And a lot of times the guys at that level would go, okay, that's reasonable. Here's some people you need to work with.
And this speaks directly to who you're having the conversation with.
Yes, exactly.
If you're having a conversation with a senior level business person that understands the components of value, that is a perfectly appropriate response. But if you're talking to somebody lower level, they don't think that way. All they hear about is the number, and that causes them to fall out of their seat. So I like to say what the range is going to be, and I'm going to explain to them 12 different parameters and opportunities that we have to bring that range to the lower end of the range. But let's be clear about something. At this stage in the sales process, success is going in at the highest possible price that doesn't get you fired from the process.
Yeah.
If you've done your job right, there should be weeping and moaning and gnashing of the teeth, but they should continue to engage with you. If on the other hand, you encounter silence, you went in too high. That's bad. Silence is very, very bad. Disengagement is very, very bad. We want people to be irritated, annoyed. We want them to call us thieves and carpetbaggers, but we don't want them to stop engaging with us. That's how you'll know it at this point in the sales process if you've done your job right. You pissed them off, but you didn't get fired from the process.
Right. If they're still engaged and like you said, they're pissed off, that means they're still very interested and you still have a lot of room to move.
Exactly.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, so then the question becomes, which I think you've already answered, but let's be more explicit. When should you think about providing pricing?
Not until you have the ROI in a business case.
Yes.
And this is a good point to talk about what should budgetary pricing look like. Okay. This is Keno's rule of 40. Keno's rule of 40. So, as a general rule of thumb, customers will pay about 25% of the mutually agreed to benefit, whether it's revenue generation or cost reduction. They will generally pay about 25%. So, if through the process of a validation event or coming up with the business case that both you and the customers collectively agree is a valid business case, that they're willing to stand up for these dollars, if you can save them $1 million, you can be reasonably assured you're going to walk out of there with $250K as a general rule of thumb.
Yeah. I used to ask for 50. I used to say, even if we're off by 50%, let's say we're off by 50%, when you get to the economic buyer, it's still, we're using your numbers from your people, which are sitting right here and can validate that. But just let's say we're off by 50%. You just give me 50% of it. Now, at the end of the day, did I always walk out with 50% of it? No.
No, that's some of
point. You probably, on average, probably walked out with 25 to 35% of it.
Anything north of 25, you've done an outstanding job. So for budgetary pricing purposes, knowing that there's going to be some haggling, you want to go in at 40% of the number. That's Keno's rule of 40. So in the illustration that we just talked about, where the business case supports $1 million cost reduction or $1 million in revenue improvement, we're going to propose $400,000. I don't know a business person on the planet that wouldn't spend $400,000 to get $1 million back, with the understanding we're going to end up at about $250. So what success looks like, anything that you get out of that account north of $250, you've done a really good job. If you got $250, you did what you were supposed to do. If you got below $250, well, you need to go back and listen to some more episodes of Revenue Builders.
Right. And if you have been in front of the economic buyer and say, with your people, here's the cost justification we're presenting to you, it's $1 million, then at that point, what you're saying is you're asking that economic buyer for $400,000, knowing full well in your mind that even if he agrees to this, you still have the steps of going through procurement and you might get beat down to $300,000 or $250,000. That's what
two things there, John. Two thoughts. First and foremost, do not go into that economic buyer meeting without a strong champion that you've already socialized these price points with. Look, the economic buyer meeting, everybody should know before the meeting even starts how the story ends. Because it's an exercise.
If you have the right champion, like you said, the champion's already greased the skids with the economic buyer. This is what's going to happen in the meeting.
Everybody knows what's going to happen. And Cap, this is the point in the process where I want to know if procurement is going to beat us down even further. So you and I can agree on a price, but we're going to pad that price by whatever amount of pound of flesh that procurement needs to get in order to get the win. So if we settle on 300 and the procurement is going to need at least 15 points to feel good about things, then the proposal we're going to put forward is 360 in that.
What is your feeling on going to procurement early?
I don't like it because in very rare instances, procurement really making the decision. Procurement is simply trying to get the best deal that they can, but the deal is really settled on with the business and with the economic buyer. Now, if you're in a sales process that's competitive and you're coming in late, you may not have a choice. So then the question begets, how do we work with procurement and give them what they need so that we can remain in the sales process, not get fired in the sales process, but still protect our margins so that we can do some horse trading towards the end. And that, unfortunately, is not something we're going to be able to orchestrate on Revenue Builders. There's a lot more art that comes into that than science.
So I have I'm going to agree with 75% of you. And they go, here's my deal.
You left out the respectfully piece to Kino and
respectfully.
Disagree on 25%.
When you have what I call the great equalizer as the champion, when you have the great equalizer, in my opinion, it's been my experience that going to procurement early, when you understand power and influence, procurement is simply trying to get the best value for the company. They don't override power and influence. My experience, they don't override power and influence. What I like to do is I like to go early and ask questions like, if a deal is to come to you, what are some of the basic things it has to have? And I kind of find it's been my experience that those folks are like the Maytag repairman. They get involved so late in the process that they actually resent being Dr. No. I mean, in today's environment, procurement folks, many of them are actually paid on the performance of the business units. So it's not like the old days of, you get paid on what you save on a contract and blah, blah, blah. So I like doing that. And then, not in all cases, but in most cases, I like doing that. And then I hold the champion accountable for not getting alligator arms. I don't like this. We go with the champion, and at the end of the day, champion says, okay, Kino, you've done a really, really great job. Now go to procurement and let them get their pound of flesh. I don't like that because I call that alligator arms. With really good champions, I'm like, you need this as bad as we do. You can't get alligator arms. And if you can't see me, but if you can just see my arms like in my armpits, my hands in my armpits right now, that means I feel for you, but I can't touch you. I don't let champions do that to me. So
yeah, the thing is that there's a lot of organizations where once the business has made a decision, that they put a gag order on the business side of the house.
That's why I go early. That's why
separation of church and state effectively, right? So there's a gag order on the business people. You can no longer talk to these salespeople. I'm procurement. I got total control of this deal now. You got to let me do my job.
Yep.
That's why I go early.
You make a good point, Cap, and we really aren't in disagreement. I think we're talking about two completely different situations. Situation A, what you have a champion, that is completely appropriate. The situation that I was talking about where we're trying to hedge and buy ourselves some time is when we're coming into the sales process late. It's a competitive deal. Yeah. The success criteria has already been set, and you have no champion. You're simply trying to stay in the deal, and you're trying to concurrently assess if you should go fight for this business. What is the likelihood that you can renegotiate the success criteria that have been established so that it's at least a fair fight, which I don't believe in, by the way. I don't believe in fair fights. I don't believe that they exist. In that scenario, you don't have a champion, and procurement is the last. If procurement is going to engage you, they're going to make sure that your price is competitive enough to allow you to even participate in the evaluation. So it's really a terrible situation to be in.
Agreed.
They may even pull in some other competitors, especially when the numbers are large. They may decide at the last minute they're pulling in some competition and just get some low-level price quotes from them, which is plenty of salespeople that'll do that. And that can cause disruption. And that's why, to your earlier point, Kino, you have to be able to show in an ROI, quantifiable business value. If you can't do that and justify that, you're in real trouble towards the end of the sales process.
And all the other things we talked about is the great equalizer is the champion. That's not just happening to you. That's happening to you and the champion. So if they pull in people late, if procurement does X, Y, and Z, that's why you can't lose that concept of that great equalizer on the champion, because that's not just happening to you. It's happening to you and the champion.
Going back to the premise of when we start negotiating, I also don't want to gloss over this point. Ultimately, you're going to be judged relative to the ROI. That is what will ultimately drive the price point that you end up settling in. So don't just go through the motions when you're putting together the ROI. It's got to be line item by line item. You've got to get buy-in from Skippy Jack and Freddie Joe at every step along the way, that they are prepared to back up these numbers, that you have effectively quantified the alternative. To use John's example of blade logic, and John, I'm really, really sorry that you played for the other team, but
yeah, but we were beating you guys all the time, so that's okay.
That's not quite the way that I remember things.
You got a short memory, brother.
Yeah, I think I whipped a little bit of blade logic ass back in the day. Actually, quite a bit back in the day. But you were using what it cost on a per server basis. Well, what's the alternative? Okay, you got to hire a guy to provision servers. You got to hire a guy to patch servers. There's somebody that's responsible for change and configuration management. There's somebody that's responsible for audit and compliance. Well, each and every one of those work streams has a quantitative value. So to say $2,000 a server without saying, well, right now, if my math is correct, based on my discussions, it's costing you $15,379 to manage those servers. It's costing you $3,126 to provision those servers. That's 27 server administrators at a fully burdened cost of $175,000. And this is the portion of their time that they spend doing that, and doing so forth for each and every one of those line items, so that when we start negotiating the final price, we have a ROI that's been vetted and mutually agreed upon with all parties that we can point back to. So there's no arguing about what the alternatives are. Right. That is how you end up with a high margin deal. So the moral of the story here is get crisp, become vigilant about your ROI, know it backwards and forwards, and negotiate that ROI. Negotiate how much time it takes them to do those 27 different line items. Negotiate how much incremental the solution will drive on your behalf to a level of granularity that you're not going to be worried at the end of the day about haggling over 5 or 10% of the solution, because the value is an order of magnitude greater than whatever it is that we're haggling over.
So let's go back to the $1 million value. You had your rule of 40. Mm-hmm. And now the customer comes back with a counter proposal.
Well, good. Now,
we're still in the game, so that's great.
That is. But generally speaking, they're not going to come back to you with a counter proposal unless you've been selected as vendor of choice. If they're a really sophisticated company, I remember back in the day negotiating with GE, who would not only negotiate 2 proposals with 2 vendors, would negotiate contracts. So you truly had no way of gauging how you were doing. But not many companies are GE. Suffice it to say, if they give you a counter proposal, you've been selected as vendor of choice. Okay, so now it's time to dance. Now, hopefully, the manifestation of all the other things that we've been talking about for the last 30 minutes are going to show up when it comes time to actually negotiate. So now we're going to go through Keno's negotiation protocol. Once you've given budgetary proposal, you do not negotiate any further until you get that counter proposal. So what we're looking to establish here is what I call the bookends. You've given them a budgetary proposal. They've given you a counter proposal. We now know we're going to end up somewhere in that range. We now have established the bookends. What rookie reps will do is when the customers say, you're too expensive, they'll simply gen up a new proposal. All you've done is shifted the bookend. That is all that you've done. That is a categorical mistake. So you get your counter proposal. The very first thing you do, no matter what that counter proposal is, if it's $1 less than your budgetary proposal, you fall out of your seat. You've got to win the Oscar. Okay. That is considerably less than where I thought this was going. You have to react with shock and awe, no matter what it is. And here's where you need to pay attention. You need to pay attention to their body language. You are doing this to provoke a reaction because that is going to tell you how much separation you've put. If they don't flinch when you fall out of your seat, you know you're going to end up pretty damn close to that counter proposal. What we're hoping you get instead, and this is why you don't want to do this with a procurement agent, you want to do it with somebody less savvy. What you're hoping is like, whoa, let's not get nuts here. That's a starting point. I'm sure we can bridge the gap. That's the reaction that we're looking for. That tells us that they know that they've lowball you and there's a lot more room to fleece them. That's what that's going to tell you. So first, shock and awe. Okay. The second thing that you do before you engage in any kind of a counter to their counter is you qualify the negotiation. By that, I mean you establish that whoever you negotiate with, that the project is budgeted, there is money, that if we settle on price, that they're going to pull the trigger. Second, you establish that you're only going to have to negotiate once, and that the person that you're negotiating with is empowered to finalize the agreement. And the third thing you do is establish the only thing that is keeping you from finalizing the agreement is coming to an agreement on financial terms. Until all of those conditions are met, you do not negotiate. You wait until they put you in front of the man or the woman, and that you can have confidence that once we settle, this is it. There's not going to be the procurement agent coming in over the top asking for an incremental 10% unless we agree that we'll pad the final price by 10% to give them their pound of flesh. Okay, so let's say that you get favorable responses to all of those qualifications. We have our counter proposal. We've reacted with shock and awe. We've established that this person is empowered to finalize the agreement. Now, the last step before you go back to them with a price is to gauge their willingness to compromise with you on some other elements that are important to the deal, but may not necessarily represent price. Okay? And you go like this, something like this. The gap between where we need to get to and what you've provided is pretty considerable. Now, that being said, there's a whole lot of things that represent value to us that may not necessarily cost you anything that we can use as justification to improve the price. Okay? So I don't expect that you're going to be willing to concede to all of these, but the more of these that you can respond and say yes to, the more room I have to improve the price. Okay? So I'm going to stop for a second and say something to CEOs, CFOs, heads of sales ops, VCs, VC advisors, as it pertains to what we're about to talk. It is irresponsible and unrealistic for any of you to think that a rep is going to negotiate anything that is not dictated by his or her pay plan. Okay? So you can't tell a rep you want them to negotiate a 3-year deal, but only pay them on a 1-year deal. They're going to save their friction for the things that matter to them. Reps will do what their pay plan tells them to do.
Yes, 100%.
I hope that there's alignment before we get to this stage between the company, the pay plan, and the rep, because that's what's going to ensue here. Okay? So let's say that the company has done a good job and the things that they've highlighted that they want you to fight for are also represented in your pay plan. So you just go down a little bit of a list of things that are typically important to both companies and the reps. So what are those things? First and foremost, the predictability of when the deal will close. That is what we all care about more than anything else. That speaks to our forecast. That speaks to our credibility. That speaks to the opportunity to go back and say, hey, we agreed that we were going to get this deal done by this time. Timing of the deal. Second thing, what is the length of the term? Most software companies would agree a 3-year deal is better than a 1-year deal. That's the easiest and the best way to mitigate churn. Okay? Maybe you want 5-year deals. Whatever the company believes, whatever the company is willing to pay is what's going to end up getting negotiated here. Next will be the marketing stuff that allows you to monetize the software with future prospects. That would be your willingness to work with us on a case study, your willingness to work with us on metrics, your willingness to serve as a reference if we do a good job and we do a good deployment. And here's the last one. This is a nugget. Dial in here. The worst part of a salesperson's job is what? Prospecting. That is the worst part of the job. That's the part that we loathe and despise more than anything else. What I like to ask prospects that cost them nothing, that I like to factor into the negotiation, is your willingness to sponsor us to 3, 4, 5, whatever you can get away with, non-competitive accounts at the C level. What you've just done here is negotiated some demand gen on your behalf that's going to allow you to build your book of business, because that is the easiest way to get an audience with the right person. Have somebody that is a peer, and these are all people that they go to church with, that they go to meetups with, that they're in their IT interest group, whatever. This is a real easy thing for them to say yes to. It costs them nothing, but what it's worth to you as a rep in terms of building your future pipeline is amazing. That is one of the things that when I was a rep, I would fight for more than anything else. Now, between us, whether they agree to one of those things, all 6 of those things, or none of those things, they're going to get the same price, but they don't need to know that. Okay? This is all just jelly. What we care about at the end of the day, more than anything, is getting the deal closed on time. Anything else you can get above and beyond that's probably good for your pay plan, probably good for the company, and hopefully good for your future demand gen. Whatever it is that you do, no matter what they agree to, that you agree to monetize, that you collectively agree you can monetize, go back to them with a higher price, even if it's a slightly higher price. What this does is messages to them that the price that you came back to me with the counter proposal is too low. If you say, we'll do it at that price, the message it sends to the customer is that they leave money on the table, and you've just opened yourself up to a potential renegotiation. So yes, even if it's $1 more, always come back with a higher price. That's the negotiation protocol.
Yeah. Now let's talk about T's and C's, which can also factor in to getting the deal at the end of the quarter. Talk to us a little bit about when you should grab the T's and C's and start to negotiate with the legal counsel.
Yeah. So
make sure that doesn't get in the way of anything that you've just spoken about.
First of all, it's a really good way to qualify if you're tracking towards the deal. Their willingness to either send you their contract or begin reviewing yours tells you that they're real serious about doing something for you. Yes. Second, I missed when we were talking about the qualification before you negotiate, and I missed one nugget that is important as it pertains to this point, John, and that is you stipulate that before we negotiate, it needs to be understood that the price that we end up settling on is predicated on a reasonable negotiation with the lawyers. That is, if your lawyers are going to come out of the gate with unlimited liability, termination for convenience, then we're going to have to go back and revisit the price. So you've planted a big old booby trap that those attorneys are going to step right into when they come out of the gates with their preposterous terms. So we've already talked about 2 of the biggest ones that are problematic. Termination for convenience. Oftentimes they'll want extended payment terms depending on if you're a publicly traded software company or a startup. You may have a little bit more latitude there. IP rights, all these kinds of things. We want the economic buyer and our champion agreeing up front that if legal is going to be unreasonable, it may affect the price, and we want to reserve the right to go back to them and ask them to intervene, and maybe even tell them up front what your company's hot buttons are. We've got a very firm.
I think that's the nugget. That's the nugget. I see so many companies that negotiate that get crushed at the end of the quarter with the same things in their terms and conditions, and they never bring that in up front. They're just like, they're waiting and they know it's going to get stuck on those versus having and this is my big thing for negotiation is a company competency. It's not tactics for sellers. It's a company competency. You have to prepare your sellers with like a 1-page. These are the top 10 things, Mr. and Mrs. Champion. These are the top 10 things that are coming up. And I just guarantee you, I want you to understand from our perspective, what do we mean by these? And why are these important to us? Now, I'm going to do the same thing with the procurement folks. And this is where I talk about the alligator arms. But you have to remember that we had this conversation with you. And I'm telling you that this is where we're going to potentially get into problems. And then if the champion is a champion, that's how they stand up for us at the end when these things are getting haggled over. But I see companies do it the same things every quarter.
Yeah.
Every quarter, and sometimes with the same customers on every deal. It's amazing.
I think that is a fault of leadership. Okay. If you know you're going to be doing this over and over and over again, then it's incumbent upon you to train the reps on what you're expecting. So, to take it a step further, Cap, if you're a software company that's trying to set up your reps to be successful negotiators, you've got to invest in training them on the art of negotiation. One of the best books I ever read was The Art of War, right? It speaks firsthand to negotiation. Second, you've got to really invest in the sales infrastructure they need in order to defend the price point, and that is the ROI. There should be a tool. There should be a discovery and qualification guide so that they know what inputs they need to gather to feed the ROI tool. And there should be training and how they present the ROI in a manner that's consumable. And then but second to last, there needs to be pay plan alignment. Yeah. Make sure you're paying your reps on the things that you want reflected in the outcome, because you're going to get what the pay plan says you're going to get. And then lastly, like you mentioned, Cap, stipulate your expectations way before you start getting involved in the haggling of price in the final round in T's of C's. These are terms that are non-negotiable for us. These are problematic terms. Please set the expectation with your procurement and your legal team, or let's revisit the price, because the price that we're agreed upon is a reflection with the understanding that you're not going to ask for termination for convenience. That's not a 3-year deal. The termination right is not a 3-year deal.
I like it. And then for me, there's a framework I think that companies have to put in place. The first one for me is to make sure that the reps can articulate what an alternative to a negotiated agreement looks like for the customer. That's your leverage. I want to understand what you think the customer's alternatives are. And by your discovery, and you'll know exactly where reps are, how vested, how experienced they are. When you just ask them, what is a better alternative for them? What's an alternative for them? That's the leverage. And what's an alternative for us? That's a very mature professional thing. First thing I ask is, what is an alternative to negotiate agreement for both parties? The next thing I want to know is, and this is from a company perspective, reps can't just do this. What does a great deal look like for the company? It's like an ICP, because I don't like companies coming back and going, yeah, we got a deal, and then make everybody on that team feel like crap because they discounted it or whatever. I think that's just culturally bullcrap. Like, what is the definition of a good deal? And we get that up front. And Kino, it's your bookends. And in the bookends, we got to know, you got to give the reps some experience and some ability to know that this is in the range of a good deal. I also am in huge favor of multiple options. And I'm not talking about price A, price B, price C, pick the middle one. I'm talking about giving the customer multiple options based upon things that they've talked about. It could be project-based, it could be software-based, it could be, but just giving the customer multiple options. And this helps you from having to negotiate just on price. And then the things that you guys were talking about, I'm just giving a framework here. The give gets, I think those got to be talked about as a team for a company. These are typically things that we can trade. but any give, you got to get. You just don't give these things. And that's where I see companies do say, okay, these are a list of things you can give. And if they didn't have to give anything back, then the customer discounts those and say, well, you could have given them anyways. And then the last one, hugely important for me, is an agreed upon walkaway point. This is what companies suck at. Like, what is our walkaway point? And everybody wrings their hands and gnashes teeth or whatever. But when you equip your team with those main components on a deal, on opportunities, you're in pretty good shape. You're in pretty good shape.
If you get to the point where you're talking about walkaway points, then you weren't listening and didn't do any of the stuff that we were talking about earlier in the program. What I like to do, if you've gotten crisp on the business case, is I like to monetize the cost of not getting this thing inked every day. Every single day that you don't deploy the software, it is costing you $111, $316 because of the inefficiency of how you're doing it today. That's been proven. That's been settled in the business case. We went to a validation event. You got Skippy Jack behind you saying, yep, we tried it out. We evaluated. Those are absolutely bona fide. And that puts enormous pressure on procurement and legal to get this thing done when you frame it in a way that highlights what the cost of not going forward or delaying is.
Yeah, I agree. So you've never walked away from a deal?
I have walked away from many deals. And here's a little tidbit for you. If they let you walk, you never had a chance. I have never walked away for a deal or gotten to the point where we weren't able to establish a price in the end that we both felt okay about. There's some I felt better about than others, but never that's actually cost a deal. If you walk away and they let you, you failed at the 7 steps ahead of time that would ensure that would never have happened. You didn't.
Unless it's something outside of what your company can live with.
Well,
that's the hard part.
What you're talking about, I give the grace to everybody, Cap, and we call that the act of God proviso, right? So your champion gets hit by a train, you get to take that deal off the forecast. The company gets acquired before the ink is dry on the contract, you get to take that off the forecast. So if you're the right kind of rep, you'll have discussed this with your management team well in advance.
Yeah.
That this is the price that we will agree that we're going to walk away. Anything north of this, we're going to be good. And sometimes really good companies that negotiate against you will wait until that point to see how serious you are about maintaining that price. So when you walk away, you should do it with resolve, knowing that that is as low as you're going to go. And it shouldn't be a solo cowboy mission. That should be agreed upon with your management chain. Because let me tell you, reps, what you don't want to do, you don't want to walk away from that deal and surprise your boss that was counting on that deal for the quarter, and you get the John McMahon special. And I can tell you, you don't want to be in that conversation. Win as a team, lose as a team. It will mitigate your risk and the company's risk.
I like that. Every great deal has 1,000 mothers and fathers to it. Everybody signs up and says, "Oh, we were a part of that deal." Every bad deal is a rep on an island. So yeah. I love what you just said about. Just love what you just said about all of that is like at the company level. All those things we just talked about. This is not something that we leave up to the reps to negotiate. This is a negotiation, which is a company competency. Mm-hmm. And the reps tactically do it with negotiation techniques. So I really like how you position that.
Okay, Kino, let's say the deal's all done. How do we look back and wonder or know if we truly negotiated the best that we could have?
So if you believe in Keno's rule of 40, anything that you end up north of 25% is a good deal, okay? That should be established, however, by every company. Every company should have a representation, to Cap's earlier point, on what a good deal looks like. So that becomes the bar. That becomes the definition of good. Anything north of that is great. Anything lower than that, we're not going to get to, because that was our walkaway point. But, from a non-numerical standpoint, the conditions that illustrate at the end of the day that you reached a good deal is neither party got everything that they want, but they feel relatively good about it. That is, the company feels like they paid a price that is well below the value that they're going to extract from the software, and the rep feels like they got a price that's better than the lowest price that they were willing to accept. But don't lose sight of those other things that we talked about in the negotiation that represent real value to you. If you can get sponsored to 4 net new accounts at the EB level, man, that is worth a lot. That is worth a lot. That's worth a lot to the company. If you were able to negotiate a case study, that's going to help everybody in the company when it comes to selling efforts. So don't be myopic and think just about the price. Think about the comprehensive elements of the deal when you're going to dictate and define what a good deal looks like. Payment terms, length of the term, profitability of the deal, referenceability, case studies, metrics, all of that stuff.
That's why I like doing all this stuff up front, where the company has a range of what a good deal looks like. And in that second bucket, when we talked about what does a good deal look like for us, what does a good deal look like for a customer, if we land up in that range, that's a good deal and we're moving on. There's no discussion about from the CFO, you guys didn't do this or they didn't do that. I think that's a complete waste of time. That's why you got to arm your people with that and you're moving on. And if you negotiate a bad deal, you're going to find out pretty quick. If it's, they say a cliche, win-win, if it's win-lose, you're going to figure out pretty quick what that looks like. And I've seen companies do that. They get into a win-lose relationship, or customers get a vendor into a win-lose relationship. You find out really quick in the first 6 months of how that relationship, what it really looks like and how quickly people are to turn on their experience. So
you see that in a lot of software startups where they basically get a tiger by the tail. They're like a $10 million company and then they get a giant deal from Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs and they got a tiger by the tail. They wind up losing $10 million on the thing.
Big time.
Yeah. What did we forget, buddy?
Dude, that flew.
What did we forget? I don't think we forgot anything. I guess the only thing is make sure you boys and girls out there grab your buckets and collect these pearls of wisdom as they're falling from our mouths. That's about it. So John, thank you, and John K, for having me on the show again. Always a pleasure to dance with you guys.
Dude, you crushed it. Thank you very much.
You did a great dance, Kino. We thank you very much. Thanks, Cap. And thanks to everyone for listening to another episode of the Revenue Builders Podcast.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Be sure to check us out at forcemanagement.com.